Hi, my name is Sarah Fox. I'm an assistant professor in the Human-Computer Interaction Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. And at CMU, I direct the Tech Solidarity Lab, where we draw together methods and theory from computing, design, and science and technology studies to interrogate emergent systems. And we focus our attention on the social, political, and material conditions driving the deployment of AI and automation technologies within essential sectors, specifically care, transit, and waste. And when we do this, we focus on how such systems impact existing practices, often along lines of race, gender, ability, and class. Today I'll briefly discuss through this tutorial a line of work conducted with Cynthia Bennett, Bonnie Fan, and Emily Ackerman, whose own story of micromobility motivated this work, and who I'll discuss a little bit later on, along with a number of other HCII colleagues. So first off, what is micromobility in the first place? So micromobility encompasses a wide range of shared small-scale transportation technologies used to aid in moving people and their belongings. Generally, these devices weigh up to 500 kilograms, are set to travel at low to moderate speeds, and are powered by a combination of electricity and human force. So often micromobility is networked and trackable, and users rent these transportation devices using smartphone apps. So, oops, I lost that. Okay, so on the screen, there's an image depicting a wide variety of devices, including the familiar e-bike and scooter, as well as more emergent technologies like personal delivery devices. So across the United States and other countries, startups have begun to vie for contracts to deploy micromobility in an effort to offer residents choice in urban landscapes marked by disjointed transit. The pitch centers on the fact that many cities face a last mile problem, or what bus stops, bus stops and train stations let riders off a distance away from their destination. So it could be upwards of a mile, for example, from your workplace or your home, or the grocery store where you intend to shop. So micromobility platforms are then there for riders to hop on and go the rest of the way. Yet reports of blocked curb cuts and walkways where such technologies have been deployed highlight the need for coherent regulation on the part of local governments who welcome them onto their city streets. To help think about the competing interests behind these deployments, here I turn to the notion of anticipatory politics from the nearby field of science and technology studies. So this lens allows us to interrogate how micromobility is negotiated in the here and now, with an eye toward longer-term effects from firms and city officials working together to define who benefits from particular scientific innovation. So in the words of STS scholar Gina J., anticipatory politics link hopes for the future materially and temporally to the historical contingencies of emergent scientific innovation. Here, efforts to improve movement through public space are fraught with overt and implicit assumptions about who is or needs to be mobile and toward what ends, and how that mobility should be experienced. So namely through new technologies rather than the expansion of existing public transit systems, for example. So these expectations are perhaps unsurprisingly stratified. So they impact lives in the present and relocate expectations for the future differentially based on kind of where one lives or what access one has to private versus shared mobility options. So the world-making possibilities conjured on behalf of residents by micromobility firms and municipal governance shape the interventions made possible on behalf of residents for them long into the future. So what kinds of technologies and municipal policies are practiced and proposed, et cetera. So for example, a bike share program designed to promote tourism is necessarily different than one meant for commuters, something that Seattle learned in an early micromobility experiment of their own. A delivery robot meant to shuttle lunch to busy college students likely cannot be doubly cast as access technology, something I'll delve into a little bit further on in this presentation. So again, in the words of Jay, to employ the paradigm of anticipatory politics is to recognize how orientations toward the future are subject to structural relationships and power dynamics as key determinants for whether and how scientific knowledge becomes empowered to act upon these futures. So it's co-productive with and not merely adjunct to the distribution of economic and social capital. So with this work, my collaborators ask, and I ask how commercial deployment practices become standardized as transportation plans are operationalized as municipal policy, how inequalities likely to be introduced or perpetuated by micromobility are anticipated and governed, not only around who is served by the technology, but also those who are able to define trajectories of design, legislation, and the subsequent potentialities that they allow for. And then finally, whose anticipatory knowledge counts and who gets to establish the consequences of this knowledge in deciding the trajectory of micromobility on public walkways, which links to struggles over political authority. So whose ideas about the future matter when making kind of definitions around the technologies used to allow for better transportation and to kind of govern those technologies as they operate on public rights of way. So over the course of this tutorial, I draw on interviews with government officials, micromobility representatives, and disability rights activists, as well as media analysis that covers this phenomenon. Sharing selections from vignettes we write about elsewhere, I will reflect on the products of anticipatory politics of micromobility. So from the material devices and the ways in which they're designed to state-level regulation that kind of legalizes their operation, to labor operations or labor arrangements that allow for them to operate in the here and now, despite limitations to AV technologies in the present. So each rendering certain futures present, while at times foreclosing other possibilities. So these are all kind of oriented around the objects, legislation, and labor arrangements kind of driving micromobility right now. So in many ways, micromobility has taken many cities by storm. Public officials have invited partnerships with micromobility companies. For example, here on the screen, you see Richmond, Virginia Mayor LeVar Stoney, who called networked e-scooters a fantastic addition to the local transportation landscape as he rode one through a deployment launch ceremony in 2019. Public messaging around this emergent form of transportation reports that it kind of increases eco-friendly options and low-cost movement that takes up less space. It enables kind of a decrease of congestion than a car. So it's posed as a kind of sustainable solution to kind of urban traffic and all its ills. But micromobility's impact is more nuanced than that. So media reports show vandalized and broken vehicles, resulting from kind of protests from citizens. Additionally, micromobility blocks sidewalks and crosswalks, as you can see here on the right. Kind of e-scooters are strewn across the sidewalk, making it a maze to kind of get through for pedestrians. This particularly impedes movement by people with disabilities, who often cannot ride these vehicles as they are inaccessible to many to operate. To illustrate this point, I'll next turn to a vignette from our co-author and collaborator, Emily Ackerman, who encountered a PDD in a curb cut on her way to work. So right now I'll kind of shift to sharing her words. So one day in 2019, I waited to cross a busy intersection behind a lot of people. From my vantage point, I could see that what was across the street, but as I began to cross, I realized that the delivery robot was sitting in the curb cut on the other side. No one was supervising the device, but I thought it'll move by the time I get there. But when I got there, the robot was still directly in the curb cut. So I ended up bumping up the part of the curb cut that slopes up, which is dangerous for me because I could get stuck easily. It's also painful to have such a sharp jolt to my body. So I tagged Starship, the robot manufacturer, and University of Pittsburgh, where they were deployed, in a tweet. The vehicles were immediately removed, but the gesture was short-lived. Robots from the same company were deployed again 4 days later and continued until the COVID-19 pandemic began in 2020 for the United States. So during those 4 days, they were off sidewalks. I communicated with a manufacturer who initially apologized for the bug in the technology, but the next day, Starship issued a retraction and said that they were happy to see that I got around it in the end. This retraction caused a lot of backlash at me for quote-unquote whining. I was raising a very dangerous situation, and the internet turned into this very scary place of, well, you didn't get hit by a car, right? So I felt in danger and not safe to walk around my own campus as a result of this encounter. So essentially what Emily is highlighting is the fact that she had to kind of jump a curve to get around a device that was placed within a curb cut, was stationed there, was parked there, which impeded access for her. So the curb cut is basic kind of infrastructural access afforded to Emily and others, other pedestrians through the ADA, the American with Disabilities Act. But this technology posed a kind of an immediate threat and resurfaced issues of accessibility that had kind of long been fought for and to many potentially settled in this case of the curb cut. So one micromobility operator, Carl, told us that scooter chargers like him were disincentivized from reporting broken vehicles as they would then not get paid for charging them, again posing additional threats to those who actually ride the devices. So I was supposed to mark scooters for repair and let somebody else pick them up, but after I walked half a mile or half an hour to pick up a scooter, if I could still charge it, I'd get paid for it. So I put scooters back with no brakes, Carl stated to us. And he himself sustained an injury from riding micromobility that required emergency medical attention. So here, Carl, the operator, who in fact attended to and charged the devices, redistributing them throughout the city, actually sustained an injury from using the very devices that he was in charge of. And local governments and companies have responded to accessibility concerns differently. So for example, companies have published training videos, and cities now fine riders for improperly parked micromobility vehicles. So as an example, Seattle began auditing micromobility to enforce parking regulations adopted after a pilot program, and cities have sponsored programs that offer recreational cycling with accessible bikes. None of them at the time of writing were kind of adopted permanently though, which none of these kind of accessible bike programs were adopted permanently, notably. So these provisions were reactionary and at times temporary. So Michelle, a disabled biker who cannot use standard micromobility devices, articulated a common call for early prioritization of people with disabilities. She said, quote, "One of the things that government administrators should be insisting upon is a certain percentage of a variety of adaptive bikes in the bike share program, and that the ability to use those is no more onerous than it is for able-bodied people to check out the standard bike share." So offering training and conducting audits placed responsibility on citizens to do the right thing, and recreational programs did not meet disabled people's public transportation needs. Other kind of regulatory efforts seem to disregard access altogether. So in late 2020, at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, when many were essentially looking the other way and responding to acute crisis, an Amazon and FedEx-backed bill on personal delivery devices passed in the Pennsylvania state legislature. It was the most recent in a nationwide bid to introduce legal safeguards for delivery robots to occupy city and suburban sidewalks and roadways. So PDDs, or autonomous delivery robots, as I've referred to them over these presentations, have begun to appear more prominently as a means to satisfy growing demands for delivery service, particularly during the pandemic. So proponents of the bill suggested that the law would support a future where goods ordered online would appear at customers' doorsteps within a few hours at a cost around 15 times cheaper than traditional delivery, with fewer idling vehicles blocking traffic or releasing carbon emissions. So again, this kind of call toward eco-friendliness. So at the time of writing, upwards of kind of 10 states had passed similar legislation legalizing the use of autonomous delivery robots, but the Pennsylvania bill took the previous version further in two key ways. So first, the rights of the robots to occupy public space were expanded and cemented to the point that the devices themselves are defined as pedestrians, meaning they share the same legal rights of way as human residents. The bill also increased the maximum speed with which PDDs are allowed to travel in pedestrian areas to 12 miles per hour and on roadways to 25 miles per hour, while increasing their weight limit to 550 pounds, and that's without cargo. So this amounts to what local organizers have referred to as roving refrigerators. So the weight is close to what one might find kind of functioning in a commercial kitchen. So not your kind of ordinary house kitchen, but instead one that is in the kitchen that makes huge volumes of meals. So transportation advocates and disability rights activists alike have pushed back on the notion that delivery robots offer a future that the world needs. Instead, they argue devices occupying sidewalks and streets will only exacerbate well-known issues of walkability and distract from the expansion of much-needed public transportation options. So during this legislative session debating the bill on PDDs, Pennsylvania State Representative Sarah Innamorato offered a round of questioning on devices' impact on individuals with disabilities, explicitly citing Emily Ackerman's experience. So through her encounter with Starship Robot, being kind of well known in the press and in the kind of local state media landscape, the chairman and the Micromobility representative present were actually kind of quite aware of the story. And the concerns that raised by the state rep were brushed off with a comment that local municipalities would be most well-positioned to request adequate operation plans for industry actors, given their close relationship to community members and advocates in the area. So essentially, issues of access and safety were punted to local municipalities, which, according to the past legislation, would have no recourse to override state-level policy in cases where they determined the regulation to be insufficient or counter to residents' needs. So this is a move mobility strategist David Zipper calls preemption, or when a state assumes responsibilities traditionally held by cities, or when federal government overrules states to streamline patchworks of local or state policies that complicate deployment. So as a response, the city of Pittsburgh's Department of Mobility and Infrastructure then quickly partnered with robotics company KiwiBot to pilot a set of remotely operated devices across a subset of city neighborhoods. The idea of this initiative was to test out autonomous mobility devices themselves to get a sense of the potential legislative needs and unforeseen harms that they might cause to pedestrians on the walkways by doing a kind of lived, a real life deployment. But from the onset of public discussions around this pilot, residents raised concerns around kind of labor displacement, surveillance, accessibility, among others. So one resident, for example, raised concerns around the kind of displacement of local delivery work in favor of invisible operations by remote workers in Colombia, something that drives the operations of KiwiBot's devices. So others had concerns about what the devices record, where the data lives, and by whom, with whom it is shared. So, if presumably the robots take video or at least rapid fire photography and perhaps even audio of their surroundings to operate. And so residents were concerned about what this might mean for the sharing of that data out with government actors and kind of a function creep that might happen if there were incidents on the road that that police wanted to interrogate, for example. And Emily herself provided a round of questioning regarding the accessibility concerns that were not yet addressed in kind of KiwiBot's deployment, despite the fact that it was coming a year after Starship exited the Pittsburgh area. So not only the issue of blocked curb cuts, but also the fact that the robots aren't able to ascend stairs or elevators, which in Pittsburgh is a somewhat uniquely important function. It also requires those who use it to bend over to retrieve the items inside, which is not something that everyone can easily do or do on their own. Others highlighted the topographical and infrastructural features of the city that make it both interesting as an AV testing site and difficult as a place where devices might operate as intended. And in fact, that did bear out in the pilot. So after an initial phase of mapping, one of the original neighborhoods considered for the deployment was determined not viable due to the poor condition of its sidewalks. So you can see here on the screen a chat from someone in the initial community meetings discussing the pilot that describes that the city is in fact the largest property owner and has the authority and responsibility of maintaining sidewalks, something that unfortunately is not always done or prioritized. So this made it such that the robots couldn't traverse this area. But it also means that neither can wheelchair users traverse this area easily, those with other mobility devices or strollers, etc. So it's clear that despite the keen ability to highlight likely issues with the pilots, with the operation of autonomous delivery robots in general, community concerns were registered as secondary to that of the expertise of the robotics team, or just generally the kind of drive to experiment with the pilot more generally. So only through the deployment of the devices on city streets would there be definitive insight on how they might affect the community, despite the community themselves kind of voicing concerns repeatedly. So the results of the pilot and later did actually center on the collection of infrastructure data rather than kind of initial aims of small business partnership and delivery of goods to local residents. So essentially kind of pivoting away from delivering burritos or convenience store items to the collection of data about the condition of sidewalks. But it's not actually clear what this adds, as community members, like I mentioned before, had been voicing these same concerns for the better part of the last decade, particularly on sidewalks. So here on the screen, you'll see a headline from 2013 where residents of a neighborhood in Pittsburgh called out to the city to maintain overgrown trees and fix broken sidewalks. This has largely been left undone, even still. So this kind of leaves the question What might counter anticipatory knowledge making look like? And so in cases that we've seen here in the FACT community and in other kind of adjacent communities, this might mean kind of working with community members to surface evidence on existing or near-term harms. So here in Pittsburgh, there's been a fair amount of research done on micromobility and AV shuttles that have been proposed at various points over the past 5 or so years by transit organizers, particularly the organization Pittsburghers for Public Transit. And in fact, a lot of their organizing work has kind of led to a reshaping of priorities around particularly an AV shuttle project that was abandoned with a transition to a new mayoral administration. That shuttle project would have used public funds to primarily transport university students, faculty, and staff to and from their own kind of main campus to a new site where they were building out. And in another example from San Diego, Whitney et al. Have worked to kind of use knowledge and practice core to HCI to coalition build with community organizers in kind of claiming rights of input into and political oversight over surveillance technology, in this case, deployed and embedded within the streetlights in the city. We might also think about kind of repurposing techniques from design and community computing to preemptively considered hazard and risks of future AI systems. So not necessarily leveraged toward design or redesign of those systems, but rather to provide kind of testimony, generate policy, or otherwise support community governance strategies. So one example of this is kind of from the work of Nick Martellero and colleagues who explore the engineering practice of failure mode and hazard analysis in the ways in which we can kind of resume and rework that method in a more kind of community-oriented way, in a way to kind of mitigate potential harms that these technologies might pose to those operating the devices or living in a world in which they are deployed. So with that, I'll close, and I'd like to open it up to discussion and again, kind of ask, this last slide is essentially an invitation to think with you together about kind of what counter-anticipatory knowledge might look like and how we might use our own methods and strategies within and around kind of research communities to ensure that community governance is seen as a priority.
So there are like a couple of questions that we post in the chat, but we can also wait for people to share their thoughts. This is slightly different from, like, I think maybe you're familiar with Zoom, so I guess we have a couple of panelists here. Maybe I can just let them in to.
Maybe Sarah, you could start by having a look at those the questions in the Q&A there, which just as a starting point for a conversation.
Yeah, so a lot of these technologies are actually, or I should say, the delivery robots are actually being kind of are being more and more oriented toward suburban contexts. I'm not necessarily seeing as many of the kind of personal devices like e-scooters or bike shares necessarily in suburban contexts, but delivery devices like those FedEx or Amazon examples are ones that are really being pursued, from my understanding, because they similarly have kind of last mile distribution centers. This is a response to the first question, I should say. Last mile distribution centers where packages are initially delivered and then delivery drivers kind of take them to be delivered to individual homes. So they are in fact kind of being more and more in focus. The second part of the question, could there be considerations made by neighborhoods that have higher incidence of certain demographics over others? Could you elaborate a bit on what you see as kind of higher incidence of certain demographics over others? Is that just referring to?
Ethnicity would be one example. Like, let's say it's a predominantly certain kind of people neighborhood. I mean, it's not that we're stereotyping the neighborhood, but we're just saying, like, there's an incident statistically speaking, and based on that, their needs are different by the locations, and so the entire policy making could be a little more inclusive with that fact.
Yeah, so there are some examples of, again, I'll just point to the delivery robots. So there are instances where researchers and others have seen promise for delivery robots to fill in the needs of residents who live in food deserts. So food deserts are essentially places where residents, neighbors don't have good access to fresh food, like fruits, vegetables, etc. Because there might not be a grocery store in the area. So a grocery store chain has not seen it as profitable to be in the area or whatever it may be. And so they may be much more reliant on convenience stores that don't necessarily have fresh food. And so I have seen, again, proponents of these delivery devices suggesting that they might have programs that would deliver fresh food on demand to residents of these areas. So kind of connecting them with fresh food so that they don't have to travel long distances. And that would certainly be something that some might benefit from, but the question remains, how or why would these companies be incentivized to do this? Would this be something that is subsidized by the government or a local government or a federal government agency, for example, the USDA or something like that? So the questions of how and why still remain, even if there is this kind of like seed of a promise.
Yeah, those are great thoughts. Also, how much of like a retrospective experience plays a role in the anticipatory policy making kind of thing?
Did you say retrospective experience?
Yeah, like.
Yeah, so thinking about that.
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's central to thinking about the future. Obviously, there's certain functions that new technologies extend. So these technologies make certain things newly possible, or extend our capacities in the here and now. But all of this, none of this is really produced on out of thin air. There's history that it relies on, and so we have to be cognizant of that. So I'll give one example that I wasn't able to provide in the talk, but that we write about elsewhere, which is that e-scooter technologies, often are deployed in neighborhoods that are regularly served by transit already. At least that's the case in Pittsburgh. And then so there's this one case in Richmond, Virginia, for example, where there was someone who was using an e-scooter, had been using it actually since it was deployed there, and enjoyed it. Used it as a part of his daily commute to work downtown. But midway through his ride, he went over a bridge into historically Black neighborhood, and the scooter halted in his tracks. So the brakes went on, and when he tried to move it manually, he heard an alarm that sounded and said that if he, continued to move the device, it would notify the police because it was suggesting that he was stealing it. And so he looked at his app and found that he was out of bounds for the service. So he got an alert on his phone suggesting that he was not allowed to be in this area. So it was in a geofenced kind of off zone. And so eventually he was able to kind of push it back to where he initially kind of rode into this territory, so back into that kind of border, and go on his way. But he was kind of obviously stressed out and confused, and later found that actually they had prohibited use of this device in the area after concerns on vandalism, etc. So it was basically, reinforcing and creating kind of digital redlining in the very areas that had not been well served by transit or the city generally for decades.
That's a very nice example. So I want to actually continue the discussion in that direction. So now that we understand, okay, the app behaves in a certain way when they switch regions, what could be a way to kind of advocate for a change there in a way like it's procedural, it follows there are these things about activism that comes up in the picture, and then there about algorithmic auditing being almost illegal in many cases. But when we look at this, it's almost like a normal occurrence, and this is not something that's wrong, it's just something that shouldn't be there, and there might be a way to kind of correct it without getting into trouble, for example. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a nice question. So in this case, there had actually been, there are kind of two ways I can imagine. There's a way that that is kind of after the fact, so after these things are designed and deployed. So when the city was negotiating a contract with, in this case, the company, the micromobility company was Bolt. So they distribute and manufacture e-scooters. So Bolt was negotiating a contract with Richmond, Virginia city government. And in that agreement, they agreed to pay a permit to apply for and pay a fee associated with the permit. And then they also agreed to have a kind of subsidized ridership program, meaning that certain users of the device, if they qualified, typically these programs are based on income level. So if they qualified due to their low income status, then they would be able to pay less or a reduced fee for using this device. But actually what happened is the neighborhoods, kind of low income neighborhoods, were slowly erased from the map where of kind of areas where the technology could be used. Again, due to these concerns on vandalism and kind of pushback in the neighborhoods where they were deployed. And so they failed to live up to that promise and that agreement. And so in that way, I would suggest that, if the community actually wanted these devices, they could call the company back to the table and say, okay, we need to renegotiate this agreement because you're not living up to it. We need to think about kind of equitable distribution and alternative ways that are not so punitive, where we can address the concerns of the community who are kind of protesting the devices or vandalizing the devices, etc., while still enriching the mobility landscape, for example. That's like maybe one take. Another take would have started much earlier and allowed for residents to be a part of those conversations and in setting the agenda for conversations around what these devices would do, where they would be distributed, and what they would really be meant to do. But a lot of the community members across the conversations that we've had with people don't necessarily, I mean, they see it as a kind of band-aid solution to the problem of disconnected transit, but not something that long-term addresses their needs. Or it's something that they use as a kind of leisure activity. It's kind of a fun thing to have, but not something that they really use to commute, for example. So others have suggested that actually, monies should be kind of poured into expanding bus routes or expanding kind of light rail options, etc. Something more sustainable and that could serve, more than one person at a time.
Okay, those are really great thoughts. We still don't have any questions from the audience, but I am interested to like pursue further. So we have like uh, these research ideas of like how robots and humans interact, and there is this whole space of like understanding emotions that like these systems elicit. So what are your thoughts in terms of micromobility here? Like, uh, these are also essentially, in some sense, if you add some, some level of intelligence, they could be robots too, right? Like, and yes, we have the whole example of Starship being like that, but maybe there are other kinds of tools that can help with micromobility that way. So yeah, just wanted to hear your take on that too.
Just the incorporation of like different autonomous vehicle technologies into these devices.
Yeah. Yeah,
Mhm.
even like AV, right? Like this whole discussion of like moral machine, where there's
Mhm.
all the idea of ethics also comes into play sometimes. So yeah,
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, so I think about like if we're thinking about AV technologies incorporated into like beyond so obviously the delivery devices incorporate them, but there's also been discussion of some degrees of autonomy incorporated into to I would say kind of do those kind of parking audits that I discussed earlier,
no,
or briefly discussed, I think. So, the maybe you've witnessed this yourselves when kind of moving through a space that has these e-scooters because they're dockless and because the idea is that you can kind of drop them anywhere that you may be going. It means that they often end up like strewn across the sidewalk or in various median, etc. I've even seen them dropped off at an on-ramp to an interstate, which is like I'm not exactly sure where the person was going. Maybe they were getting picked up by a like fast moving vehicle. But anyway, there are some startups who've kind of introduced the idea of some level of autonomy to encourage or enforce proper parking. So that's just one example, and obviously that's done in the name of safety. But it could also kind of automate other things too, like fees imposed on riders who initially didn't park properly, etc., which would probably not be super popular with those users, but is something else that you might hear about. But so far, I mean, a lot of what you see is just kind of that geofencing in terms of regulating on the device, regulating behavior on the device.
yeah, I see. Yeah, that's more easy to control the behavior when it's just within a restricted space. We have a
Mhm.
question from audience, and I would read that out loud. So, Carly Jones asks, like, hello, thank you for your talk, Sarah. As a Pittsburgh resident, I have unfortunately seen firsthand some of the issues posed by using Pittsburgh's public spaces as test beds for emerging technologies like self-driving cars. Do you have additional recommendations for how concerned citizens can effectively craft narratives about anticipated harms that will translate to public officials who are motivated by local economic development? So I guess there are like several layers to this question, and we could probably just go over them one after another.
Yeah, no, this is a great question. Crafting narratives about anticipated harms. Yeah, so I mean, I think there are certain kinds of, so again, I think in this case, since you're a Pittsburgh resident, I'll again like point to the organization Pittsburghers for Public Transit. They do an amazing job of collecting and producing research around existing kind of transportation issues, in terms of operations in place already, and kind of impacts of policy on existing routes, et cetera, but also emergent technologies. So they produced a report on AV technologies, and they've also produced a report on micromobility recently. And so a lot of times what they'll do is a combination of kind of surveying, collection of data, and then also testimony. So I think one thing that is particularly compelling when voicing concerns, say in public meetings, for example, or town halls, is this kind of personal experience that oftentimes residents have, and that make things really compelling and ground the potential harms. So Emily's experience with Starship Robot, for example, is one that was voiced again and again. So in meetings by Emily herself, but also others who'd read about her experience in the local media, and then within the kind of state legislature. But we, also heard testimony from those who just began to imagine, what these devices might look on their city block. So they essentially painted a picture. So one resident who lived, and I'll say the neighborhood because Carly, you might know, who lived in, I think it was Bloomfield, described thinking that the robots couldn't get up to the door of her house because she lived on top of a hill, and there was several flights of stairs to get there. It's a kind of setup that is really common in Pittsburgh because of the topography. And so what she was describing is kind of the limits to the technical artifact. So the fact that the device, she asked simply, can the device go upstairs? Because this would have really limited use case if not, particularly if you're kind of touting what it could do for those with limited mobility, or kind of folks who are kind of confined to their home for whatever reason. And so she could see by painting the picture of the device in the future where she lived, kind of placing it in her own neighborhood, that it would have certain limitations, and highlighted, in this case, technical constraints. But there were a variety of others, again, kind of people speaking from their own experience and painting that picture.
In some sense, I would like to extend that question to consider cities like New York, for example, or like the West Coast. We have Seattle or the Silicon Valley. So those are like really big network of sub-cities, I would say, and then they have their own transportation and things like that. So how does that work there? How would things change in that sense? I think here we are looking at hyper-local scenarios, so I'm just considering that.
So the question is, how would this work in a setting where there are a constellation of boroughs, of different, port authorities or whatever it may be? I mean, in some ways, it would be dependent on how the local government negotiated the contract. So whether it would be something that, like, ran across a number of different neighborhoods, or whether it was confined to a certain area. So again, kind of speaking about Pittsburgh, the Starship deployment was one that was in one neighborhood, and then the city-run deployment a year or so later was one that traversed a few different neighborhoods, but it was still pretty geographically confined. And that was essentially so they could keep an eye on it and kind of limit any harms done to that area and really see the effects. So they were really interested in this to, again, kind of toward kind of legislative ends, which was really unique. The product of this deployment in the end was really meant to be, less about the specifics of the operations or the kind of tuning the device to be better and better from the city perspective, and more about producing a report to the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation on how these things operate in the real world, because there's limited information about them. So in that way, it's pretty unique. But in other areas, I think it could be more expansive. Certainly, you see that in the case of e-scooters, et cetera. But again, it kind of depends on how the city sees the devices in the landscape of transportation. So I mentioned briefly, and we talk about this actually in a DIS paper that my collaborator Cynthia Bennett led last year for the conference, Designing Interactive Systems. Talks about the fact that the Seattle, the initial Seattle e-scooter, or sorry, the e-bike pilot was one that was essentially a failed experiment because it was really oriented around tourism, and Seattle is not an easy place to ride your bike. As somebody who lived there myself and tried to commute as a cyclist between different neighborhoods to the University of Washington, you have to be really committed. The weather is variable. You have to have lots of equipment, and there are some killer hills. So it's not, and these bikes are not necessarily the lightest to ride. So again, kind of a mapping or of expectations and, again, usage.
Great for the fantastic tutorial and for the. Are there any additional follow-ups or questions? I think we are at time. Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. I hope you enjoyed the rest of the.
Thank you so much, Hoda. It was great. Thank you.
Bye-bye.